I know you said most of your experience is on the investigator-initiated side. Yep. And I thought that was really unique, really great, because, most people don't get that. They don't hear those experiences. They don't hear those opportunities. And it's so, the industry is so broad. It's so many different opportunities out there, and people literally have no clue. So I felt like your story would definitely be great to share, just because you kind of put a little spin on things and to show like you don't have to be with a CRO or a sponsor, so to speak, to have a successful industry career. So I'm definitely excited to share your story with everyone.
Yeah, I think all the way around, I kind of laugh that I came into this in a very different way. It wasn't the career I walked out of college and said, hey, I didn't know what an IRB was coming out of college. I could say that right out. Didn't even really think. And I have to say, I didn't focus too much on my own career until my children were they weren't that much older, but they were probably in middle school. And I had been working at their school, so I could kind of be around. And I finally I'm going to do something for myself. And I went back to, I looked at the University of Vermont, where I had gone to school, and my parents, both my mother and my father, had gone to school there, and my dad had worked there. So I was like, well, I might look at that. And I looked at some positions, and I interviewed for a couple different things. And when I interviewed at the IRB, I just remember 20 minutes before the interview looking up and saying, oh my gosh, I better figure out what IRB stands for. I walked in and literally just looked it up.
Oh, that's funny.
And I just remember in the first interview thinking, well, the good thing is this is going to be challenging. It doesn't, it didn't sound like your everyday position. And you're going to laugh. They had parking where, in a big university, sometimes that's the worst thing about a university job. You're stuck being shuttled somewhere. And the IRB at UVM at that time was off campus, had their own parking. So I was like, this sounds like a great job. And kind of went into it for those reasons, as funny as that is, didn't know a lot about research at the time. And I fell in love with it that first year. And I knew exactly when I was like, this is this is the field I want to be in. I was actually at a cocktail party, and somebody brought up the HPV vaccine, which we had been one of the sites that did one of the original pieces of the research. And I was at the IRB working in safety. So I read everything that came through safety-wise. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this is fantastic research. I mean, this is going to be mind-blowing. This is just going to make such a big difference. And I heard somebody say, oh, I would never let my kids get that. And I was like, what? And they said something they had read, those myths that people put out that are all wrong about research. And I started to talk to the person. I was like, oh, no, don't believe this, that, and the other. You need to look at the research. You can always go to the FDA website. Right. And here's some great places where you can get information. And on the way home from that party, I thought to myself, wow, when you're that invested in something that you do for work, that you want to talk about it at a cocktail party, you care about something. And that's when it really hit me. I'm like, I love what I do. I love research. I love being involved in it. And I see it in my head. I'm like, this is where medical science changes. We have all these therapies out there, but nothing really, how they break through is through research. And it made me feel good to feel like we were making a difference that way. And so that was how I kind of got into realizing that I was going to make a career out of it. And then stuck with it ever since. And I worked at a couple of IRBs. I became a coordinator for a number of years. And I'm so glad I did that, because I think that's where anybody who's a CRA, if you've sat on the side of a coordinator, you understand, if you're at an IRB, you read they send you a list of their deviations, and you say, why would any study have this many deviations? And then you become a coordinator, and you're like, oh man, I can tell you why you have that many deviations. You can't get people in for every visit on the right window, and you can't always, every blood test doesn't get drawn. And and there are times when, dry ice doesn't show up or whatever. And it changes your point of view, having been on, both like, on the regulatory side where you're reading, all these reports that come in, and then being on the coordinator side where you're writing reports and you're working with the patients and you see kind of how these things happen.
Right.
And I think those two things came together really well, so that when I became a monitor, I was like, I kind of understood the regulations and I understood why the reality is a little different, and I think that those were the two things that kind of came together in monitoring and made it like, okay, this makes sense, because I feel like I can help both sides from where I am in the monitoring position. So that's kind of like, I'm really glad I had the IRB experience, because understanding the regulations helps everybody. And the regulations are pretty tough. We are such a regulated field.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking a step back, because I did not officially, I know you've already given a lot of great information, and I didn't have a chance to officially introduce you. So I want to welcome everyone to Confessions of a CRA, another great episode with Theresa Bouchard Goddard. Did I pronounce your name right?
Yeah.
Okay. I always want to make sure I pronounce the names right. I'm a stickler for that. But like I said, welcome to another great episode. And today she is going to share her journey with us, and give us some insight into the monitoring CRA side of the industry from an investigator-initiated study perspective. So very excited to have her today. And as you'll see, she has so much information to share. So just going back to what you've already said, so was the regulatory side of the industry, was that how you got your start into the industry? Because I have a lot of people that reach out and they say, hey, I'm a regulatory specialist, I'm a regulatory coordinator. Would you say that that's a good entry-level role into transitioning into a CRA position?
I would definitely say so. I think the backbones of monitoring really are in regulatory, because if you understand the regulations and you understand how to interpret them, because the regulations, some of them are kind of vague on purpose, and you really need to be able to take the federal regulations, but also take in like local, state, whatever the institution you're working at, their policies are, and integrate them. That's going to help everybody. I think that's the backbone, because even when you think about, I did auditing for a little while, and I used to say, what we audit against are those regulations.
Right. So
if you already understand the regulations, it's going to help you when you're looking at a piece of research and saying, did it follow the regulations? Definitely anybody with, any regulatory specialist, anybody working at an IRB, anybody, writing policies maybe at an institution, those type of positions are going to help you, because that's really what you're monitoring off of. It's not, monitoring isn't just looking at one data point and then looking at the source and saying, okay, do those things match? That's a tiny part of it. A big part of it is saying, in the big picture, did this, fit into a protocol, and does the protocol and what they're doing fit into the regulations?
Right.
So I definitely think I think it helped me the most was starting in regulatory.
I agree. As a CTA, I had quite a bit of regulatory responsibilities in terms of collecting ISF documents to put into the TMF and reconciling everything. And without that, I think, honestly, I might have been lost as a monitor, because they train you a little bit in those training programs. But you and I both know, like, when it comes to regulatory, like, you have to have experience, because if it's a local or central IRB, like, everybody's different in terms of how they process their documents and, what their approvals look like, what their submissions look like. So it's like, unless you have that direct experience, you're lost. And like you said, monitoring is so much more than just, verifying data points. And when you have, a couple of hours or even a couple of days, but you have all this data to look at, but you still need to look at IP, you still need to look at the ISF. You know what I mean? Like you only have a couple of hours or so, but you have all these things you need to review. And if you have no clue, you don't stand a chance.
Yeah, you do not have time to sit at a site and look up all the regulations while you're looking at it. You have to have that backbone's understanding already, you know. You have and that is true. I think that's a big part of it. And that's where, as much as I always say, I felt like I went in backwards starting at an IRB, but really it was what gave me, really good bones to the structure of what I do now. But
I agree. It's the same for myself, which is why I always advise people to take on those sort of kind of roles, if not a direct regulatory role, but something that will, like the study coordinator or CTA roles that will give you multi-level experience and not just, the one thing. Of course, you got to get in however you can, but if you have those opportunities, they're great. So even going back a little bit further, a lot of people always want to, they're curious about education and what type of education we all had, because, it's also different. So share with us, where you went to school, what your major was, things of that nature.
Well, I always think that's kind of a funny story too, because I went to the University of Vermont because my father worked there. My siblings all went there. My mother went there. My grandmother even went there. And I grew up on the edge of the campus. So it was kind of like a given. And I studied English because I wanted to be a writer. And, I look back now, I kind of laugh at it. It's not that I don't use writing in just about everything that I do, but it didn't end up being a career that I even, came out of college and I realized, well, I got to get a job until I write a book or something. And then, needless to say, ended up in research, which I don't regret at all because I love what I do. Mm-hmm. And I figure I can write a book someday anyhow. Maybe it'll be about research, who knows? One of my mentors, actually, Harry Wingfield, has written a couple of books on research. So I kind of think, maybe someday. But had no idea I was going to end up in this field. I did start studying for my master's in public health when I was at UVM, but that was later in life. When I was actually working as a clinical research coordinator. And that was also at the University of Vermont. And I never finished that. And I look back now, I'm like, kind of, I guess I wish I had, but I realized part of the way in, I had taken all the classes in like medical ethics and, medical terminology, anything that really helped what I was doing. And then I was down to these courses that didn't even sound exciting. And I was like, maybe that's not the right field or the right fit. Right. So I held off, and I think that was actually the year when I stopped taking classes towards my master's in public health. I went to a SoCRA conference, and I got my SoCRA certification. Yeah. And that was a huge step for me because it was wonderful to be around a whole group of people who made their career out of research. And it gave me that incentive. I was in a tiny little state at the time that didn't have a lot of options in research. So I think going to that SoCRA conference really gave me that viewpoint that I could make a whole career out of this. I could keep going up the ladder. There were other places I could go. And that made a big difference to me. I would tell anybody that the certifications in research are fantastic. The conferences that I have been to since then every one of them has been a benefit to meet the people in your field and gain the education, that's current in your field is just amazing. So, anybody looking at going into the field, I would say, go to the conferences. You will get so much out of that. Mm-hmm. And any of the certifications too. I know as I look back also, so some of my friends in the field who do very well, a lot of them do have some, like a BA in biology or something a little more in the science field. And maybe if I had it to do over and if I'd known what field I would end up in, right, I probably would have gone that route. I think that's very helpful. And also some nursing experience or something, or those areas, if people are trying to figure out, what would lead towards the field. But like I said, I started with an English major or an English degree from UVM, and I got where I am. So it can be done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've even met people with history degrees, music degrees, art degrees. So like you said, it can be done. So awesome. That's wow. And I don't really hear a lot of people talk about, they'll talk about the certifications. And when I say certifications, I specifically mean through SoCRA and ACRP. Since those are the two main industry recognized organizations. But they don't talk about the conferences and the other
meeting the colleagues. Yeah. The conferences are near and dear to my heart because, like I said, at the time I was in a tiny little state with very little going on in research, except, the university had good clinical research program, but nothing else really. And I didn't have mentors around me. When I was a coordinator, even I was the only coordinator in ophthalmology. I was and I worked for the university, but I worked inside the hospital. So I was kind of this lone person in this little office. And the conferences really meant so much to me. It broadened my view. It gave me the experience and a lot of the education that I got that was outside of what I would have gotten in the clinic came from those conferences. I cannot speak to that enough. That made it was a turning point in my career. Going and getting my SoCRA certification really helped me to make some decisions after that about where I was heading. And
wow, that's awesome. And I can say the same. I actually didn't get my SoCRA certification until after I became a CRA, though. But it definitely does help with, advance your career and solidify your knowledge and your baseline of, expertise. So I agree. I agree. And conferences was something that I also participated in even before going into the clinical research industry on the preclinical side of things. And people really sleep on conferences. They don't understand the power. I feel like the thing that prevents most people is the amount of time that they usually are, the length of time, because it's multiple days, and then the investment of what the financial costs are. But they really are worth it if you consider it as not, you spending money or it costs this much or whatever, but consider it as an investment into your future. I would say they're truly worth it because the networking, the opportunities, the people that you meet, the inspiration, the motivation, just everything, all of the above, it's just on a whole nother level.
I agree completely. The people that you'll meet and the opportunities ahead of you. I'm still close friends with the people that I met at the first conference I went to, which makes me kind of giggle. Yeah. I sat next to Rebecca Vagan-Spooner, and we are still close friends. We talk by email all the time, and she's in Virginia. And I think about that. I'm still close friends with the first people I met at the first conference I went to.
Wow. And our industry is big, but it's kind of small in the same regard because it's, we constantly frequently run into the same people, and you never know when you may find yourself needing an opportunity, and you can just reach out to, like you said, someone you met at a conference, and you don't even have to apply, so to speak. You just speak with a person, submit your resume, CV, what have you, and then you're in an interview.
Makes a big difference.
It really does. It really does. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up because no one has ever brought up the opportunities associated with conferences. So I appreciate that. So when did you decide, or when did you become interested or aware of the CRA position, and then, decide, hey, this is something that, I would like to pursue or get into?
When I moved down to Florida, I started at Orlando Health over in Orlando at an IRB. And I think even before I moved down to Florida, I had started looking at IRBs across the country because I was like, I think I want to go back to that. That's where I had started. Kind of thought that's where I was heading. And so I looked at a number of them and reached out. Was very lucky to have gotten the job at Orlando Health because I worked with two amazing men over there, Jonathan Lynn and Harry Wingfield, and they became mentors. And to this day, before I took the last position or my current position, I talked to my closest mentors like before accepting the position. So, having mentors is also a huge part of, I think, what helps you in a position like ours. But I was over at Orlando Health, and I have to say I totally enjoyed it. Was having a great time working there. And I realized that here I was this far into my career, and I had no real strong oncology education or experience. And I think you need that. I will say oncology clinical research is different, and you really have to get in there and get your feet wet to figure it out. Oncology, the therapies are different. The mindset, a clinical trial looks so different, and it's really important. And here I was in Orlando going, well, one of the leading cancer centers is an hour and a half away. And I applied to Moffitt in Tampa, and I had met somebody special in Tampa, was kind of looking to move a little closer to him anyhow. But the first position that had opened up that I applied to was an internal monitoring position. And I really, before applying for that position, I hadn't thought it through. I'd met some wonderful monitors, and I guess, I'd kind of looked at what they did and thought, well, I don't have that experience. And the position came open, like I said, at Moffitt, and I interviewed for that. And it was such a good fit. And I have to say I was very blessed. Again, I started working for Dana Zajac, and she had such amazing experience because she had been a clinical research nurse in oncology for years. And she had been there when they came up with, a lot of the therapies that we're now using as standard of care. And she could talk to what the clinical trials were like before we had some of the things in place that we have now. And it was, I learned so much from her, and I got into oncology in a place where there was a lot of education going on. And that was one tremendous thing about Moffitt is that there was education always being offered. I could go to, any lecture I wanted basically, and everybody was really involved in research education, and that helped a lot. And so becoming an internal monitor there was, really, like I said, I kind of went into it saying, I need to learn more about oncology. I need to get that experience. But that's where I really kind of realized that all of my tools were really, exactly what you kind of need to be a monitor. And that's where my skill base was heading me for. So it was a really good fit. And I think the first year that I started doing the traveling monitor, I was like, at first I was like, oh my gosh, I have to stay so organized because, there's going from site to site and, really, taking care of your own time and being, you have to be very organized, and you have to be very independent and learn to just, really set up your own schedule and go through everything. You get such a short time when you get on site sometimes, and, you get to a coordinator says, okay, I come in at 9, so you can show up at 9, and you're like, oh my gosh, that gives me like 7 hours on site. I think I learned the most that first year, learning to organize my time and the traveling and setting up, we did all setting up our own travel and our own hotels and everything. And that was really good experience for me. So I was kind of learning both at the same time. I was learning how to be a monitor, the bones of it, while I was learning oncology. And, I think it took me a little while to really realize that this was a good fit for my skill set. I think at first I was a little overwhelmed. But I think within a year or so, I said, oh gosh, this is really where I was heading. I love the data. I love that we're helping to clean it and to get it in a place that helps that data become something useful that can get a product on the market. And I kind of found my niche that way, because I always knew I was never going to be that. I was never going to be in the front line, like putting the needle in somebody's arm. Like, that's not going to be me, And then when I found that this other side, knowing the regulatory, being very, detail oriented maybe, and liking cleaning data, where a lot of people don't like that side of it. I said, gosh, I guess this is really a good fit that way. So that's kind of how I took that leap and went into it. Now, I have to say most of the trials that I worked on over there were almost all investigator initiated. So that was kind of where I got into, like I said, that side of it rather than the industry. It was just because that's what we were doing. A lot of the trials that we were running had a monitor from industry if it was a big industry sponsored trial, and it was the internal studies that needed the internal monitoring at that we were doing. So it was kind of interesting. It was the side I guess I hadn't seen when I was a coordinator, because when I was a coordinator, we didn't do any internal or investigator initiated studies at all. So that was new when I got there. I was like, what do you mean that? What does this mean? The investigator's writing it? Where's the protocol from the sponsor? They're like, no, the investigator's writing it, So that became different. The other thing that I thought was very interesting with that is you are really getting a protocol that maybe is, it wasn't written by industry. And you, as the monitor during startup, you're really helping them. You're going through and you're the one looking for the inconsistencies, and you're the one looking at the calendar and saying, hey, your calendar doesn't meet what you said in the protocol and things like that. So it's an interesting difference being a monitor for an investigator initiated, because you have a little more of that involvement in the organic startup and making it all work. I think a lot of times in the industry side, you're kind of handed the protocol after it's already clean and set and ready, So it's a little different that way, the involvement at that level.
Nice. And what else would you say would be the difference between the investigator initiated versus sponsor initiated studies?
A lot of it is that getting involved, and sometimes having a little more responsibility for those things. There isn't like a sponsor to run back and say, hey, get us, forms on this and this, that, and the other. Sometimes you are the one saying, hey, we're going to need an AE log, and it's going to need these other columns because, you're capturing, whatever the immunotherapies and things like this. Right. And so you're a little more responsible for like the organic setup and the makeup that you can't depend on a sponsor providing things to you, the tools and the education sometimes too, where, the sponsor comes in for like a big SIV and whatever, and they lay everything out and kind of roll it like a big sponsored study. But when it's investigator initiated, sometimes you're dealing with, the teams maybe have never run their own trial. Maybe the only time they've, worked in research, some of them, is to work on a trial that's already been, those things have been set up. Mm-hmm. So you have to be, you really have to be responsible for a little more of the education, a little more of the organization, and creating the tools that nobody's going to hand to you. There's not going to be a DOA log that's all clean and pretty and set up and handed to you. And even, down to the little things like explaining the roles and who would be qualified to fill certain roles in the study, rather than kind of having that, handed to you from an investigator or a sponsored side. So it can be very different that way. And I do feel like, you're responsible a little more for the details that nobody actually maybe even wanted to look at, And you really have to be on top of like the things that nobody else is going to be there to, to make sure you have like a chart of all the IRB approvals and when the amendments are going through, because these are being done sometimes, with you involved. When amendments, they're prepping an amendment, there's no team to go through and make sure the amendment captures everything that it needs to capture, and then it, is written right. You are the one helping them review it before it goes to the IRB. Right. And you're the one saying, I need a copy of the IRB approval once you get it, and making sure everything's filed. So it's a little more organic that way, but I think it's good because it forces you to get your hands kind of into all the little pieces. And then, sometimes if you have to do the work yourself, you're better at reviewing it. I think like when I was a coordinator, we didn't have a reg person and I didn't have a data person and I didn't have anybody to shipping the specimens. So I had to do that myself too. But because I had to do it, it forced me to really learn these processes, which makes it so much easier to review it later. I know what I'm looking for because, I had to fill those forms out when I was coordinator or order the dry ice. Right, but, so I think that's the interesting part about the investigator-initiated studies. And, a lot of times they're run so differently because they don't have all the resources. And you kind of learn to do without a lot of those resources.
Right. And just to confirm, you said you were able to travel or you were required to travel as a CRA within Moffitt.
Yeah. We had Moffitt ran some, they acted as their own CRO for some multi-center trials. Also, they had some pediatric trials that were pretty big. I went kind of all over. I was in LA and Ohio and Baltimore and Miami. And so, yeah.
Really all over. Wow.
Yeah. So if anybody thinks, if you're an internal monitor, you don't have to travel. That's not true. I mean, right. I think some may not, but I certainly did do quite a bit. And it matters what, I'm sure there's some, every institution's a little different. But.
Right. And there are some sponsors, although it may be few, where you have like that truly regional travel where it's like within driving distance. So I've
heard of that.
Yeah. I personally haven't experienced it, but I do have colleagues where all of their sites are literally within like 2 or 3 hours from their home. So it does happen that way. Within a sponsor, within a CRO, within an institution, it just kind of depends on that specific protocol, that specific project.
Yep.
But I'm glad you pointed that out because a lot of people, they tend to shy away from the institution opportunities, monitor opportunities, because they feel as though they won't get that regional traveling experience. Yeah. But I'm glad you pointed that out. That's not always the case.
Yeah. And it really, even in our monitoring core, when I started it at Moffitt, we had some people who traveled a lot and some people who didn't travel as much according to what studies they were assigned. And to be honest with you, I offered right away because at that point, I lived on my own, my kids were grown and a lot of the people I was working with had little kids at home. And I remember saying, I don't mind, I'll take that one. I'll take this study. At the time I was kind of like, I'll catch a baseball game in Baltimore and then, something else in a hockey game in Ohio. And so I did do a lot of that. I have to say the people who say that the traveling is like drudgery or something, I'm like, I enjoyed it. I found a way if you're okay traveling alone, and I think you have to be in our field. But if you're confident and comfortable traveling alone, you can have some fun, I saw some interesting places and, all just because I happen to be there. So.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes I tend to get caught up in like the day-to-day, like, I got to go from this city to that city to that city. But then it's also my choice, right? Because I'm one of those people that I go to my hotel. I know you're going to say it's bad, but I specifically choose hotels that have good room service because once I get in there, like I'm not coming out until
Until that report's written, right? Or something. Yeah.
until it's time to like go on site or go to the airport. So like I do everything in the hotel, like literally everything.
Oh, wow.
But I don't recommend it because, you know, it takes away from the experience and then it becomes mundane. And then that's when you start, you know, dreading going on visits and stuff like that. But I'm also kind of like that homebody person. So it does work for me.
Oh,
and like
yeah.
you said, it just kind of, it depends on you and you have to be okay with being alone and all those things.
Right.
But I don't recommend doing that. Even if you're like that introvert person, still, please get out.